So as we look at tools, we looked at the things we just talked about in our first, we looked at the student's skills and abilities and needs, and we looked at the environment, we narrowed down the task, and now we start to generate some tools for this student. The kinds of things they came up with were adapted pencils, clipboards to hold the paper, wiki sticks, mobile device, lots of different things. And I wanted to just give you a couple of other sources for Feature Match. These were websites that Kelly Fauner shared with me, and I really appreciate them and wanted to pass them on to you. If you're needing to get some more language and be more comfortable with some devices and things that are available in the area of AAC, these websites might be a useful resource for you. So the next WADI tool then is handout 8, and it's called the WADI Tool Identification Guide. And what it asks you to do is write those descriptors across the top of what this student really needs, and then begin to look at some tools that you have readily available or that are available commercially or that you could create, and see how you can get something that has those descriptions that you need. So that's sort of the analyzing. And now we move into what I think of as kind of the heart of the WADI process, and that should be the heart of any assistive technology assessment, is that you're going to generate and prioritize some solutions, make some decisions about that, and then develop a trial use plan. The WADI uses a 5-step decision-making process. That's problem identification, solution generation, solution selection, implementation, and follow-up. And it's a really important thing. What I found when I was in Wisconsin, I surveyed about 3,000 special educators, including special ed teachers, OTs, PTs, a couple social workers, speech and language pathologists, all school psychologists working in the area of special education. And what I found was that only 2% of them had any training in team decision-making and team process. And yet we go into meetings where we have to make decisions that are really life-changing for children. And I want you to have a process that works well for you and well for that child. To do this, you really need a facilitator and a recorder and a timekeeper, and you can certainly share those roles at different times. But I struggled with what I want to say to you about this because we don't have much time, but I think it's critical to write everything down, and that has to be written up where you see it, whether you're typing on your computer and showing it on the screen, you're writing on a whiteboard by hand, or you're using a flip chart. It doesn't matter. But the critical part is that you create something where everyone sees the same words. And this is important for a couple of reasons. I love the study by Killingworth in 2010, who said that people spend an average of 46.9% of their waking hours thinking about something other than what they're supposed to be doing. That means at least 30% of you have had your mind wander already during my presentation, just because that's the way life is. When you have settled about what you're going to cook for dinner, or found out a way to make up for having forgotten to tell your husband something, or whatever happened, you can look back and see the content that we're talking about because it's there in front of you. You don't have all the words, but you have the core meaning, and that creates a shared group memory. So that means a week from now, if I were to run into 2 or 3 of you and say, well, what did Penny say about the most important thing was in when you're doing that decision-making meeting, that all of you would say right where everyone could see it, because it creates a shared group memory. And it also keeps everyone on the same step. And let me show you an example with this next screen. This is our handout number 9, the WADI AT Decision-Making Guide. What I've added in here are these numbers. So I told you we use a 5-step decision-making process. The top part, problem identification, is that whole first step. We're looking at the student's abilities and needs. We're looking at the environmental considerations and the tasks. We're narrowing it down to one task. Then we go on to the next step, which is solution generation. And that's a really brainstorming part of the task, where there is no chance to say, oh, we can't do that. We tried it last year. It's too expensive. The principal won't let us, or whatever. You can't say that. You just generate all these things. And it's fine if there's different words for the same thing or a different product that does the same thing. That's just fine. And this is a very short time because you want to kick in the right side of the brain and get everybody talking. And the thing I want to point out to you here is then we go to solution selection. And this timeline up here is what I use when I do full day workshops on this process. And I give you 45 minutes to do a simulated AT assessment. I take almost half of that, between a third and half of that, in this time right here, in this solution selection. This is the time when you discuss it. You say, oh, well, tablet and iPad are kind of the same thing, and so forth. You combine things. You may prioritize and say, these are the things we can do next week, tomorrow even. These are the things that will take longer. We're going to have to borrow this from the state lending library. So let's do this fourth or whatever. But it's a time of combining. It's a time of making decisions. It's important to think about how we make this work, and whenever possible, to have consensus. I don't have time to teach about that today, but it's a critical piece. But having a structure where you all know the process and you're visually working through the process really helps. So I told you it could help keep you on the same step. So I want to tell you about my brain. When you start telling me a problem about a student, I already have a solution when you're way up here. So I'm going to blurt out, oh, he needs an iPad with that new such and such an app. You're going to say, well, Penny, that's a solution idea. Let me write it right here. Okay, everybody, we're still talking about the student's abilities. It's that simple. When you don't have a good system and you don't have a visual way to manage that, you get into that argument that takes you totally off task, makes your meeting run twice as long, and ends up with no decision. So I want you to think about the critical piece of writing the key points where everyone can see them and using that as a way to keep you on the right steps of the task. I'm not going to have you do an activity together, but I would want you to think about this for a minute, about what I've said about decision making. If you have anything you'd like to say in the chat, I'll take a look at it. If you have a question or a comment about using the AT decision-making process that I've talked about, this would be the time to do that before we move into our last few slides.
It looks pretty quiet out there.
I see that. I've put you all to sleep, or your minds have all wandered. The other thing I was going to say about writing something down where you can see it is that our auditory memory can only hold about 7 items. And plus or minus 2, mine is often -2, so I can only 5 items. So, and it goes immediately into short-term memory. And for some of us, then it never comes back. So the critical piece is having that visual idea of the fact that I'm about to talk about trials and collecting data. So planning the AT trial is critical. You need to identify the times and the places and how long the trial needs to last. And it helps to select a functional, really frequently occurring activity from the identified tasks, and specifying when and how the student will use the devices, and specifically who is in charge, who's supporting that student, what kind of cues and supports do they need, and is there any training needed for the student or for the staff who will be in charge. It's an important time. So we need our trials to be really valuable for us, because this is really the time that we find out if something's going to work. More WADI handouts, handout 10 and 11, the WADI AT trial use guide and the WADI AT trial use summary can really help guide your effective tasks. Thank you, Iris, for your comment. I have to tell you, it really, really works, and it really, really helps. We're going to move on now to formulating final recommendation and developing an implementation plan. And I just want you to think about, for long-term use, again, we have to really go back to who's going to do what, who sets it up, who needs training, who provides training, when are we going to do it, how will we handle maintenance and repair, how do we know that it's getting implemented as stated, and what does the supervisor need to know about this teacher's involvement or this therapist's involvement so that they can follow up and make sure that tasks get done. One of the biggest complaints in AT case law is failure to implement. So we get an assessment, we get a recommendation, and then everything falls apart. So this planning for long-term use is really critical. And I also think it tells us why we have to have trials so that we do have a tool that we know works before we purchase it and go into long-term use and start worrying about how it's working. So I said I would leave you with some resources. Of course, there's the WADI website, which I still love and have some involvement with. There's the AT Internet modules that I directed you to several times. I would also mention Education Tech Points, which is the website that I manage with Gail Bowser, and of a lot of our publications and forums and training and referrals and so forth. Quiet.org, QIAT.org, where you can get the quality indicators, which are a wonderful set of documents that can guide us in our assistive technology services, including AT assessment. And then the NATE network, which is another one that I run with Gail Bowser and Denise DeCoste, and that has a lot about AT teams and capacity building. And finally, I'll just say one more time, I know this wasn't enough for you to be able to change what you do and learn new skills. I would ask you to please consider looking at the AT Internet modules and to the one I've done on using the WADI process. I think it really gives you a little more time to look at it and to think about it, how you will apply it. And now I would like to know how you might use this information, what you might do differently in your setting. If you have questions or concerns, I'm happy to do my best to answer them. You can ask me out loud, it'd be fine, or you can type in the chat. I'm looking at it too.